So on to Sigmund Freud. We're going to give him somewhat short shrift, I'm afraid, because we only have an hour to talk about Freud, but that's okay. We can get a fair way through it. He's still persona non grata, I would say, among experimental psychologists and probably clinical psychologists as well, but that seems to me to be very unfair. Freud is one of those thinkers who all that's left are his mistakes. And the reason for that is that everything that he discovered or put forward is so entrenched in our culture now that we think it's self-evident. And so everything correct has been assimilated, and that just leaves everything that's more or less floating on top to look wrong. But Freud is also one of those thinkers who was always wrong in an interesting way, and that's very useful. And so I also think that many of the things that he put his finger on that are of still disputed, for example, the idea of the Oedipus complex, are much more useful than people are willing to admit, especially in the clinical realm, because the Oedipal complex, which we'll talk about quite a bit, is actually a description of a fairly stable form of familial psychopathology where the child gets trapped within the confines of a family because the relationship with one parent or the other or both is so tight that they can't break beyond it, and maybe because of their own inability to move towards independence, but more frequently because of what you might describe as a kind of conspiracy between the son and the parent, or the child and the parent, that prevents them from moving towards autonomous life and keeps them in a state of, essentially a state of childhood dependence. Freud said, "I started my professional activity as a neurologist trying to bring relief to my neurotic patients. Under the influence of an older friend and by my own efforts, I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious in psychic life, the role of instinctual urges and so on. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis, a part of psychology, and a new treatment for the neuroses. I had to pay heavily for this bit of good luck. People did not believe in my facts and thought my theories unsavory. Resistance was strong and unrelenting. In the end, I succeeded in inquiring pupils and building up an international psychoanalytic association. But the struggle is not over." He made that recording just shortly before he died. He moved to England to escape the Nazis. Before Freud, I guess, the mind was, it's complicated because Freud, of course, was not the only person to be thinking along the lines that he thought. Pierre Janet, who was one of his teachers, had originated and started to develop many of the ideas that I would say were popularized by Freud. But the idea of the unconscious mind was certainly not as well developed prior to Freud as it became afterwards. And before that, I suppose you might say that insofar as people thought of the mind at all, they thought of in philosophical terms, and the mind would be that part of you that you're aware of, like in the Cartesian sense. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and it kind of seems in some sense self-evident that you're aware of and have control over the contents of your own mind. But that was what Freud really questioned. And he questioned it deeply. He said, well, first of all, the idea that you're one thing, like one mind, is a dubious idea to begin with, because people are full of internal contradictions. And then the idea that your mind is all of one type, it's all of one form, was also very questionable as far as Freud was concerned, because you could be fractionated into subcomponents. And the idea, for example, that your anger or your sexual desire could be an autonomous part of your personality in some sense, that it could overtake you and control you, that's really a Freudian idea. And one of the classic Freudian ideas really is that people are made out of subpersonalities, and those subpersonalities are alive. And that's one of the things I really like about the psychoanalytic thinkers, because even the psychologists who say over the last 30 years or thereabouts, since maybe longer now, anyways, since the demise of behaviorism as an ideology, and the admission by psychologists that there were There is an active unconscious, or many active unconsciouses, which is a better way of thinking about it. Psychologists still really haven't come to terms with the idea in any deep sense that these unconscious processes are living things. You know, when psychologists talk, for example, about the cognitive unconscious, they're talking about something that they describe in more machine-like, with more machine-like metaphors, and that's not reasonable. You understand things a lot better if you understand that the subcomponents that make up people, the fragmentary bits of them, and also the biological subsystems that are part and parcel of your being are much more intelligently viewed as personalities. They're kind of unidimensional personalities in some sense, so that, for example, if you're angry, you're nothing but angry. I mean, that's an overstatement, obviously. Or if you're afraid, you're nothing but afraid. Or if you're hungry, you're nothing but hunger. Well, that's certainly true if you get hungry enough, or thirsty, or too hot, or any of those things. You kind of collapse to a simpler personality that only has one motivation in mind. And we'll talk a lot as we progress about the grounding of those unidimensional motivational systems in biology. But I'd have to say that Freud was among the first, at least the first, to synthesize a coherent theory of this multiplicity and to put it forth while also insisting that much of what was happening to you and inside of you was not immediately accessible to your awareness. And it's a very profound discovery. It means, among many other things, that you can formulate ideas. First of all, it means that you can act out things that you don't understand for reasons that you don't understand. It also means that your memory can contain things that's represented in one way, but that can't be understood in another. So, for example, and we know this is true because there are independent memory systems. There's an independent memory system for procedures, that's for actions. There's an independent memory system for what you might describe as imagination, for the memory that uses images. And then there's another system that articulates knowledge, that's the semantic memory system. And it's not obvious at all that the contents of all of those are equivalent. And that's why, for example, you can dream things that you don't know, because one of the things you might think is that your dreams watch you act, and they watch other people act, and then they make a little drama out of that, and that drama has information in it, but you don't necessarily know what that information is, in that you can't describe it consciously, right? It's akin to the Piagetian idea that kids can play a game and you can take them away from the game and then they won't know how to describe the rules even though they can play the game. And so dreams can contain information that's full of the encoding of behavior that has information in it that you're not consciously aware of. And so then you can become consciously aware of that in a kind of a revelation, say. Maybe that's what you do when you become aware of the meaning of a dream or the meaning of a fantasy or something like that. And that's all our ability to think that way in some ways can be traced back to Freud. Now, Freud concentrated mostly on, I would say, at least in terms of pathology, on sexual and aggressive impulses. And I don't think that there's any mystery for modern people about why aggressive impulses might be particularly difficult to integrate into the personality and might remain underdeveloped, or we'll say repressed, although those aren't the same thing. And I think you might think that in different times in society, some things are allowed to surface and express themselves and other things are less allowed. And so Victorian times had a number of characteristics that made the repression of sexuality particularly likely, and perhaps also the repression of aggression. And we're talking about Victorian times in Europe, obviously, and only one time in one place. As Henry Ellenberger says, this is a great book, by the way, The Discovery of the Unconscious. If you're really interested in psychoanalytic ideas, Freud, Jung, and Adler, and also the history of those ideas, there's no better book than The Discovery of the Unconscious. It's an absolutely remarkable book, a great work of scholarship. I think it goes for about 250 pages before it even gets to Freud, and so it places Freud's discoveries in their historical context, so that's a really good thing to know. Ellenberger says it was a world shaped by man for man, in which women occupied the second place. Political rights for women did not exist. The separation and dissimilarity of the sexes was sharper than today. Women who wore slacks, their hair short, or smoked were hardly to be found, and the universities admitted no female students. Man's authority over his children and his wife was unquestioned. Education was authoritarian. The despotic father was a common figure and was particularly conspicuous only when he became extremely cruel. Laws were more repressive, delinquent youth sternly punished, and corporal punishment was considered indispensable. Now, so the times themselves, I would say, were harsher and more repressive, but then there was an element to sexuality that was also extraordinarily problematic. I mean, the first thing you might notice, might consider, and people generally don't, it's almost impossible to overstate how revolutionary the birth control pill actually is. You know, people like to think that the political rights that women have attained have been a consequence of a political struggle, but I don't buy that for a second. I don't think that's true even in the least. I think that what happened was that we underwent a biological revolution in the 1950s, late 1950s, with the emergence of the birth control pill, and that, for the first time in human history, gave women pretty reliable control over their reproductive function, and that really transformed them into entirely different biological beings in many, many ways. Like, here's an example, a subtle example. So, you know, if you track women through their ovulation cycle and you show them a picture of a man, same man, and you do nothing but vary his jaw width, when they're ovulating, the guy with the wider jaw is more attractive, and when they're not ovulating, the farthest away from that, the guy with the thinner jaw is more attractive, and that's associated with testosterone levels. And so women who are fertile like more masculine men, and basically if you're on the pill, then you're never in that ovulation phase. And so one thing that may have happened, and I don't know this for sure, but it's interesting to consider, is that since women have been taking the birth control pill, their preference for less masculine men has become more pronounced. And that could easily be one of the things that's fueling at least some of the tension that's existed and exists now politically between men and women. But the point is that you just cannot ignore the massive consequences of a biological revolution like that, and to make any other factor causal when you're trying to understand the political movements, especially in the last, say, 40 years, you're putting the cart before the horse. Now, it's reasonable to point out that the pill wouldn't have been accepted as a technology if certain political changes with regards to the emancipation of women hadn't already been in place, right? No one would have even been allowed to do something like investigate contraception. So you can't separate the biological from the political entirely, but it's still very useful to organizing your thinking to realize just how profound a revolution that was. But now back in the Victorian times, see, there's another thing about sexuality. Modern people like to think that there's nothing dangerous about sex, and that is like the stupidest thing you could possibly ever hypothesize, because everything about it is dangerous. It's dangerous emotionally, it's dangerous socially, it's dangerous because of the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, and it's dangerous because of the possibility of sickness, and that's a major one. I mean, so when AIDS emerged in the 1980s, that could have easily killed all of us. Now, the fact that it didn't was wonderful, but it did kill hundreds of millions of people. So it was no joke, it was a big deal, and AIDS mutated to take advantage of promiscuity. And so the relationship between sexual behavior and the transmission of disease is actually mediated at the biological level. But anyways, back in the 1890s, they had the same problem, right? They had the problem with syphilis. And syphilis is one nasty disease. It can mimic almost any other disease, and it's devastating to your nervous system, and you can pass it on to your children. And so part of the reason that sexuality was heavily repressed in the Victorian period was not only because of the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, the relative poverty of people. You know, back in 1895 in Europe, the average person lived on less than $1 a day in modern terms. You know, it's almost impossible to understand how poor people were. And so sex in a poverty-stricken place is also a lot more dangerous than it is in a rich place, because especially if given the lack of employment opportunities for women back in the Victorian period, if you happened to get pregnant out of wedlock, you were in serious trouble. And so the fact that sexuality was repressed is hardly a surprise, because it was so difficult to integrate into the full-fledged personality, you know, and as it still is. So sexual repression supposedly characteristic feature of the Victorian period was often merely the expression of two facts: the lack of diffusion of contraceptives and the fear of venereal disease. It was all the more dangerous because of the great spread of prostitution, and because prostitutes were almost invariably contaminated and therefore potential sources of infection. We can hardly imagine today how monstrous syphilis appeared to people of that time. Well, we can imagine it a little bit better than they could in 1970, because it hasn't, AIDS is still with us, although it's nowhere near the plague that it was, say, 25 years ago. Well, here's the Freudian world. So let's take a look at the history of, or the idea of the unconscious to begin with. And one of the things that you might want to consider conceptually is that there are many different forms of unconscious. There's not just one. And so Alain Berger points out that by 1900, 4 functions of the unconscious had been described. There's a conservative function. So the unconscious stores memories often inaccessible to voluntary recall. Well, that's a strange one. Obviously you remember your past, but you don't remember all of what you can remember at any given time, and you don't really have access to that full store of memories, although you can try to remember. So the unconscious is you could imagine the memories are represented somehow neurologically, but the neurological structure isn't exactly the mind. Like, the neurological structure isn't exactly your consciousness. There's some relationship between them that we don't know. And the unconscious, from a conceptual perspective, is the place that your memories are, that you sometimes can get access to and sometimes can't. And so you might think, well, that there are the memories that you can't get access to. There might be a variety of reasons you can't get access to them. One might be that you've just forgotten them. And one might be that they're so painful that you don't want to bring them to mind. You'll engage in tricks to stop yourself from getting access to them. Or maybe they're memories that are so complex and painful that even if you did get access to them, you wouldn't exactly know what to do with them. And so there's not a lot of reason for you to bring them to mind, because all it is pain without any utility. And when you understand that a little bit, you understand more about what Freud meant by repression. The thing about Freud is that he kind of believed that, like many people believe now, that when you remember an event in the past, it's almost as if you're using a videotape recorder, and that when you experience that, the memory is somehow recorded in you like it happened. But that's not a very accurate version of how memory works. I mean, we know that memories can be easily distorted. For example, if you interview someone about an event and you make suggestions that there was something present in the event that wasn't there, and then you bring them back a couple of weeks later and you ask them about the same event, they'll often incorporate the thing that they were told into the event. And the idea that you can make an objective record of something that's happening to you is kind of a strange notion anyways, because, so for example, if you're having an argument with someone and later you're asked what the argument was about and the other person is asked what the argument is about, there's no necessary reason why the accounts will jibe at all, because a lot of time when you're having an argument with someone, you're arguing about what the argument is about, right? You say, well, you're angry at me. Well, why? This is why I think you're angry at me. And you say, no, this is why I think this event has occurred. And you're thinking about, especially if we know each other well, you're thinking about the contextualization of that event across our entire history. And I'm doing the same thing. And I'm going to highlight things that you're not going to highlight. And I'm going to draw causal inferences that you're not going to draw. And for us just to get on the same page about the memory is going to be very difficult. So the idea that, especially with complex interactions with people, that you can somehow make a video recording of the memory and actually capture what happens is very, very, it's not true. You can't. I mean, you might be able to extract out certain objective facts, but generally, if it's a dialogical issue, if it's a relationship issue, it spans such a long period of time that just cutting a slice of it out doesn't constitute a reasonable record of what it means. And that's what you're more concerned with too. Like when you have an experience, you're not so much concerned about what happened from an objective perspective. You're more concerned about what the experience means. And then you might ask, well, what does it mean to mean something? And that was the question I was trying to answer in that paper I had you read right at the beginning of the class. But one of the things that meaning means is that it has implication for the way you look at the world or the way you act in the world. And so if I tell you something meaningful, what that's going to mean is in the future you're going to act slightly differently, or maybe radically differently, depending on how meaningful it is, but also that the way that you look at the world has shifted. And the way that you look at the world is actually an unconscious process. I mean, you don't know while you're looking at the world how it is or why it is that you're looking at the world in that way. I mean, because, well, first of all, it would just be too complicated. And second, you wouldn't be able to concentrate on what was actually going on. So your attention, for example, is mediated by unconscious forces. And you know that perfectly well. And this is another Freudian observation. You know, if you're sitting down to study, for example, your conscious intent is to study, but you know perfectly well that all sorts of distraction fantasies are going to enter the theater of your imagination non-stop and annoyingly, and there isn't really a lot you can do about that except maybe wait it out. You know, so you'll be sitting there reading and your attention will flicker away. You'll think about, I don't know, maybe you want to watch Jane the Virgin on Netflix or something like that, or maybe it's time to have a peanut butter sandwich, or you should get the dust bunnies out from underneath the bed, or it's time to go outside and have a cigarette, or maybe it's time for a cup of coffee, or it's like all these subsystems in you that would like something aren't very happy just to sit there while you read this thing that you're actually bored by, and so they pop up and try to take control of your perceptions and your actions non-stop. Maybe you think, well, this is a stupid course anyways, why do I have to read this damn paper, and what am I doing in university, and what's the point of life? It's like you can really get going if you're trying to avoid doing your homework, and then you might think, well, what is it in you that's trying to avoid? Because after all, you took the damn course and you told yourself to sit down. Why don't you listen? Well, because you're a mess. That's basically why. You haven't got control over yourself at all. And no more than I have control over this laptop. Okay, so there's the memory function of the unconscious, and there's the dissolutive function. That's an interesting one. The unconscious contains habits, once voluntary, now automatized, and dissociated elements of the personality, which may lead a parasitic existence. That's an interesting one. I would relate that more to procedural memory. You know, so what you've done is practice certain habits, whatever they might be, let's call them bad habits, and you like those things to get under control, but you can't. So maybe when you're speaking, for example, you use like and you know, and you say a lot. And you've practiced that, so you're really good at it, and you'd like to stop it, but you don't get to, because you've built that little machine right into your being, right? It's neurologically wired, and it's not under conscious control, and anything you practice becomes that. It becomes part of you, and that's another element of the unconscious, a different part. And then there's a creative part, which is that, well, you know, you're sitting around and maybe you're trying to write something, or maybe you want to produce a piece of art or a piece of music, or maybe you're just laying in bed dreaming and you have all these weird ideas, and especially in dreams, it's like, where do those things come from? And even more strange, one of the things that's really weird about dreams, and almost impossibly weird, is that you're an observer in the dream. It's like a dream is something that happens to you. Well, you're dreaming it, theoretically, so how is it that you can be an observer? It's almost like you're watching a video game or a movie, but you're producing it, at least in principle, although the psychoanalysts would say, well, no, not exactly. Your ego isn't producing it, your unconscious is producing it. It's a different thing. It's a different thing. And of course, Jung would say, well, it's deeper than that. The collective unconscious might be producing it. It's in some sense, it isn't you exactly, or it isn't the you that you think of when you think of you. And that's the ego from the Freudian perspective, the you that you identify with. That's the ego. And outside of that is the unconscious. The id, that's more the place of impulses. And you could think about those as the biological subsystems that can derail your thinking, right? And that govern things like hunger and sex and aggression and your basic instincts is another way of putting it. And it's a reasonable way of thinking about it, because these are subsystems that you share with animals. You share them certainly with mammals. You share most of them with reptiles. You share a lot of them with amphibians, and even going all the way down to crustaceans. There's commonality, for example, in the dominance hierarchy circuits. And so these are very, very old things. And the idea that you're in control of them is, well, you're not exactly in control of them. And I would say the less integrated you are, the less you're in control of them, and the more they're in control of you. And that can get really out of hand, you know. you can be like with people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, which seems to be, I would say, the dissolutive elements in some sense of the unconscious, the way that it's portrayed here. Poor people with obsessive compulsive disorder, they can spend half their time doing things that they can't really control, and they have very strong impulses to do them, and it's very hard on them to block them. You know, they'll almost panic if those things are blocked. And then you have people with Tourette's syndrome, you know, that they'll be doing all sorts of weird dances and spouting off obscenities and imitating people without being able to control it, and sometimes a little bit of antipsychotic medication can dampen that down, but it's as if there are these autonomous semi-spirits inside of them that grip control over their behavior and make them do things. And you know, you find that to some degree in your own life, because maybe you've become very attracted to someone, even maybe you don't want to be attracted to the person, and then you find yourself, you know, texting them when you know perfectly well that you should be going to bed, and you know, you're in a grip of something, and you can't control it, and that's all part of the unconscious and all part of what Freud was studying. The dynamic unconscious, it's alive, and it's a composite. The mind is a composite of contradictory drives. Now, the way Freud thought about this basically was that with the id and the ego and the superego, so if you think about the id as the place where these contradictory drives emerge, so it's sort of nature within. The ego is the thing that's sort of being pushed back and forth by those contradictory drives, and the superego is the thing that's on top saying, you better behave yourself, you better behave yourself. And so it's a